I don't know, bluffer, I suppose, when I'm talking about things, because I've built a career around not knowing an awful lot about a lot of things, but knowing enough to get away with it. Now, most journalists I know admit that we can glean and digest information quickly, repeat it back to you, but only for the requisite amount of time that we're on air, and then boof, it's gone, it's gone. Another thing I think it's fair to say from my own experience of nearly 4 decades, is that most journalists aren't particularly numerate, hence opting to talk a lot instead of doing calculations and things. And that's my excuse. I've presented budget programs and felt like I was skimming the surface of the topic of the economy because I was more concerned about politically what the dimension was there. And so I was missing half the picture, I suppose. This is super important because we're all due an election soon, aren't we? And probably not necessarily in the autumn. Lots of people will be thinking, they'll be talking about the economy. That's not the case in normal times. We have a tendency to file that under complicated and too difficult, leave it to others who know more. But we should surely know more because we're living, working and voting in Scotland. And this is the very essence of the economy in plain English. I am the plain English involved. Our mission is that we want these sessions to be short, sweet, clear, and simple. Many of you watching with us today will know this stuff or much of it, but we're keen to broaden the understanding beyond the experts. We need to communicate concepts better for all of our sakes. We've press ganged some brilliant minds to talk to us over the coming weeks, and our first guest is champing at the bit. I can see him now. We will have around half an hour to play with. We really want to use it well. So get your questions into that chat box, please. Don't be shy. We will feed this to our expert speaker and bat it about. So fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Our first guest of the series is Professor Graeme Roy. I'm going to hand over to him to explain who he is and what he actually does. Graeme, you're on. Over to you.
2 seconds, Graeme. There was a tight delay on the broadcast to some of the channels at the beginning. So the bit that I said about the whole point of this session started with going, I'm a fraud. So we'll just do that little bit again, going, so very good welcome to everyone here. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, which was established, it's an organisation established in 1985 to increase diversity of thought on the economy. And the Economy in Plain English sessions we're doing today and for you in the future are part of a series to increase that understanding. And so Claire's just introduced it, and I hope everyone now has got that. And now over to Graeme to tell us all about the economy.
Going very well, very smooth.
Great, thank you, Susan and Claire. Yeah, so I'm Graeme Roy. I'm a Professor of Economics at the University of Glasgow, but I'm also chair of something called the Scottish Fiscal Commission, which is the independent budget authority and fiscal forecaster for the Scottish Government's budget. So we have a role in helping policymakers deliver a budget each year by providing some independent scrutiny and insight into how the economy is doing.
And how often do you report back, Graeme?
So formally, we have to report twice a year, but we do, our big set piece event comes out at the same time as the Scottish Government's budget. So when the Deputy First Minister stands up and announce the budget plans for the year, at the same time as we stand up and announce what's happening to the economy and what we think is happening to the overall budget level. So that's primarily when we do our main piece of work.
Gotcha. Now, it's a simple first question, or it seems so, ostensibly. What is the economy? But before you even answer that, Graeme, I've got a couple of definitions. And actually, Susan, I'm going to ask you first of all, if I say the word economy to you, come on, what does it mean?
Well, I've told Graeme this before. When I was at school, I always thought economy was about maths. And the only people that studied the economy at our school at that time were people that were really, really good at maths. And so I did science, and I thought economics was a definite science. And it was only as I got older and I learned more, and I have to say I've never formally studied the economy. I learned that it's a social science. And actually, in all the analysis that are made, there are lots and lots of choices, and there are assumptions about how people's behavior works. And I just got more and more fascinated with who was making decisions and how they're made, and actually how two economists can look at the same data and come up with really different results. And that was kind of what started me on my journey to thinking about the economy and how it works.
Okay, before I turn to you, Graeme, I've got a couple of quick definitions here. The state of the economy is the state of a country or region in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. And then you get economics is the study of scarcity and its implications for the use of resources, production of goods and services, growth of production and welfare over time, and a great variety of other complex issues of vital concern to society. Flipping heck, it's broad, isn't it? How do you define it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I mean, listening to these two answers there comes back to very similar to a point that Susan was making, that actually a lot of people think it's about consumption and finance and maths, and I think for me, I think your second answer is the one that I always think of, was what is economics about. So the easiest way I try and explain it to people is, if you think that everything that we deal with in the world is scarce. So if you think about a really big level as a world, as a global society, we have scarce resources, we have finite number of people at any one time in the economy, and the global economy is essentially, how do you manage these scarce resources? How do you make choices over these scarce resources? And it goes right down to a national level, or even at an individual level. So if you take us, we have a finite number of hours in a day, so we need to make choices about how we allocate our time during the day. We have a finite amount of income, so we need to make choices about what we spend that income on, and we trade them off. We trade maybe working an extra hour in exchange for the promise it might be to save a bit more, it might be to spend a bit more money. So we're making choices all the time about where we have scarce resources. And that, for me, is a study of the economy. At an individual level, it's the choices we make, but it's also at a global level, at a national level. Governments make choices about whether to tax or whether to spend. Businesses make the choices about whether to invest, whether to increase production, how much to pay workers. All of those decisions are essentially a choice about scarcity, and it's all about incentives, it's all about different ways of allocating resources. And for me, that's the economy, which means that it's absolutely everything that we do. It determines everything that matters to us as individuals, as a society, as a global society. The economy is at the heart of everything that we do.
So if it's about making choices, you can make the wrong choices as well as
course.
right choices. And it's terribly subjective, isn't it? And very political.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and so you can make bad choices. You can make good choices. You can also make choices that people disagree with, and people's preferences will differ about what choices they'll make. So, for example, I might be quite happy to work an extra hour in exchange for some more income that I might want to use to buy something. Somebody else might make the exact opposite decision. Say, look, actually, I'd prefer not to work an hour because I'd like to use that hour to spend time with my family or to do something else. So because everything's about how we respond as individuals to choices and about our own assessments of how we manage our time or manage our resources, then we'll get different answers. So that's why, as economists, you get lots of different answers, because you're dealing with how people make decisions. And back to Susan's point about, is this a science? It's a human science. And therefore, the minute you involve humans, you're going to get quite radically different outcomes.
Absolutely. And in amongst this, I think, Susan, you were thinking about this a little bit earlier when Graeme was explaining what he does. The policymaker's role in all this, can you explain?
Yeah, I mean, so if you start to think about, so if you think about economics is about the study of choices and scarce resources and how we allocate them. You get people you get individuals in the economy, you've got businesses in the economy, but we also have government in the economy. And there's a good reason that government's got a really big role in the economy, because they're there to provide resources when things get difficult. They're there to help make our economy work better, whether that be through basically providing some key services and the like. So government is a crucial actor, a crucial kind of organization within the economy. And the people who make these decisions, obviously there's a democratic process in there, but there's essentially then policymakers who are ultimately the ones actually making the decision at a given point in time. And they are absolutely crucial to how any economy works, but crucially an economy like Scotland, where you have a really important role for government.
Now, before we go any further, I just want to say, anyone who fancies, I think somebody's just commented, that's great. I was just anticipating something there. Do let us know your questions, because we've only got about half an hour to play with. In fact, less than that now. So don't be shy, do jump in. I've got another question which might seem bleeding obvious to you, Graeme. How does Scotland's economy work? It's a big question, but can you make sense of it for me?
Yeah. So this is, so it's a really big question. So the first thing is that when we define something like the Scottish economy, it's really all about measurement. So it's about trying to get a handle on the size, the performance of what we define as being the Scottish economy. And that might sound relatively obvious, but you immediately get into thorny questions about, well, where do you draw that boundary? So does that include elements that are offshore Scotland's economy? Does it include things that are just purely onshore Scotland's economy? What goes into our economy? So is it all sectors, or is it parts of the economy that may be quite difficult to measure? Does it include elements that have got, you maybe buy and sell, or does it include elements like volunteering and all those sorts of things? So the question about what is the Scottish economy immediately gets into quite a thorny question around measurement, and there's big debates about, are we measuring it correctly, and some of the problems in that. But essentially, how does the economy work? Well, perhaps the easiest way to think about it is that if you think that essentially in an economy like Scotland, you have all of us as essentially consumers in that economy, so people wanting to essentially buy goods and services, and then you've got a bunch of firms who are wanting to sell us goods and services. So one of the key planks to our economy is essentially a market exists where we can buy goods and services from these firms and businesses. So that could be online, it could be down Princes Street, it could be in your local supermarket, but that's one key plank of our economy. Now, an obvious question is, well, how do we get the money, the resources in order to buy these goods and services? Well, the way that happens is that those same firms, they essentially buy a service from us. They buy our effort, they buy our employment, they buy our ideas, they buy our savings. So there's another market that exists in our economy, and the economists, we use the term, it's one of these kind of grand confusing terms we use as economists. We call it factors of production, but that's essentially what you and I are. We are factors of production. We can essentially help businesses produce the goods and services that matter. So what you've got is you essentially got us on one side as households wanting to buy goods and services, businesses on the other side wanting to sell goods and services. But in order for the businesses to be able to make these goods and services, they need us in order to provide essentially the effort and the labour market to produce these goods and services. So what you get is a circular flow in our economy. So essentially, we are buying goods and services from the businesses. They are selling us the goods and services. How do we pay for these goods and services? Well, we get businesses to employ us, to pay us wages. And with those wages, we can then buy the goods and services. And that circular flow is essentially how an economy like Scotland's work. And at the centre of that is the whole idea of markets, us going to buy goods and services, and then firms essentially giving us resources by employing us and paying us a wage.
That makes sense to me. This is good. I want to pick you up on the lexicon in a moment, but Susan, have we got some technical issues here if people are having trouble?
No, so I'm not sure. No one will hear me say this. If there some people need to refresh, but luckily Adrian Attor responded to Mike Stevenson, who was struggling with his thing, and he's now refreshed. So I think it's on track. Yeah, I think we're okay now. I was just going to ask Graeme, because you mentioned market quite a few times, and one of the things that I hear people say a lot in the media is free market. So what does it really mean, and is there such a thing as a free market?
So it's a great question. So as I said, so in an economy like Scotland or the UK, then we essentially talk about having a market-based economy, and that phrase market-based is important because it's market, but it's got other elements in there as well. And the obvious contrast to this would be a centrally planned economy. So when I was talking about us buying goods and services from a market and then businesses essentially, paying for our labour and giving us a job and paying us. In other economies, that might be planned. So the state would essentially plan what goods and services were produced. The state would essentially say you were going to work in this industry. The state would determine what wage you were paid and the like. But we're in a market-based economy, so there's this, that the market has a key role in that. And so that we start to get into the definitions and the controversies around is how free or how regulated should markets be? So should you essentially just say, okay, let's not have any kind of moral or any political involvement in determining these outcomes, and just let essentially decision makers on an individual basis come to agreements amongst themselves? And that essentially is what a free market, broadly speaking, what people who would talk about a free market would essentially be thinking of, that there's no real role for government to be involved in that in any way, or decision, or any influence from a policy or a political or a legislative or a legal sort of view. You just let individuals do it themselves. The obvious problem with that is that clearly you need to have, in any aspect of society, you need to have rules and regulations. People can abuse certain powers. You can have unequal outcomes and the like. So in reality, government is always involved in influencing how the market operates. The big political debate and the controversy comes over is, first of all, how significant should there be of a role for government? And then secondly, governments can also fail as well. And you need to have checks and balances and rules and regulations that operate around all of that. And ultimately, that really is back to your very first question about what's the role of economics, is that ultimately this is a political decision, it's a democratic decision, and society will take a view on how these markets operate. And that's essentially where a lot of the controversy comes in about the role of government and the role of markets in the economy.
I think we'll get there. We've got a couple of questions. Let's go to Jenny's first. Graeme, can I ask you to describe the unpaid, unseen parts of the economy, for example, domestic work, childcare, adult care at home and in the community, as it relates to that market/production description of the economy? She finds it hard to articulate. I don't blame you, Jenny. What do you make of that?
So it's a great question, and it comes back to this point I was making about when we define or talk about this Scottish economy, typically we're talking about a measurement issue. So it's essentially, what do we measure that's going on in our economy? And the way that we've done that over decades now is essentially to measure the economy by how much we can essentially see taking place in the market. So where there is a market exchange between consumers and businesses, then we essentially count that up, and that's what comes up in the measurement GDP, or gross domestic product, that people may have heard of. Essentially, if I'm purchasing a product, then that essentially is measured as being, well, that's an economic activity, therefore that counts. The key problem in this is where the question from Jenny gets to the heart of, is if there is no monetary transaction, so there's no purchasing of that in the market, then it doesn't count towards GDP, so therefore doesn't measure. So a really good example of that would be is if you pay for childcare, that counts towards the measurement of the Scottish economy under current practice. If you choose to look after child yourself, then it doesn't count towards GDP or gross domestic product. If you choose to volunteer because there's no monetary transaction, it doesn't count, it doesn't score. So there's a big debate about how we can potentially better measure the economy.
Have you got an idea how we can do that? Do you have an idea for doing that better?
Yeah, so there's lots of work it's actually been something that is generated traction now, but goes way back decades about even when GDP was first produced, or gross domestic product was first produced, and it wasn't a great measure. It measures domestic product, what there is a product for. It doesn't mention broader activity within the economy. So you can get estimates of these sorts of activities. So you can estimate how much volunteer is going on in the economy, or you can measure how much informal childcare is going on in the economy, and then you can attach values to it. Just because it's not taking place in the market doesn't mean you can't attach a value to it yourself, and you can come up with your own estimates of the total amount of activity that's taking place in the economy. And we're getting much better at that. And people are much more mindful or aware of these different types of measures in the economy, and not excluding the things that we really value, like volunteering, like caring for people, like having just downtime and leisure. And these things really matter.
Right. I'm trying to get through so many questions here. Derek Young, thank you for this. I appreciate this one. It's been often said that Scotland's productivity level, there's a phrase we hear all the time, is low compared with other countries. He asks, why is this? And what do we need to do to address this? Will innovation turn this around? And if so, which areas should the government focus their support? Big questions.
Yeah, so I guess first of all, just what do we mean by productivity? So coming back to that point about the scarce resources right at the start and how we allocate them, what essentially productivity tries to capture is to say, well, look, if you've got all these resources in the world and they're scarce, and they're essentially things that you're going to try and use to improve outcomes, to improve living standards, improve quality of life, how efficient are you at turning those scarce resources into the things that really matter to people, so improved outcomes at the end of the day? And that's essentially productivity. So, example, there's only a certain amount of hours that we can work in a day. If we get through lots of stuff, we're highly productive. If we don't, if I sit around and fall asleep on the couch behind me, or kind of look out the window and daydream, then I'm not being very productive. I'm not getting through much activity and output. And the economy, the national economy, is really measured in this. We think of that in the same way. Essentially, it's how much improvement in living standards, how can we improve the quality of goods, how can we improve the quality of well-being, for the amount of effort that we're putting into it, and that's essentially productivity. And the questioner is right in the sense, if you look at Scotland in comparison and the UK in comparison to the best countries in the world, then we don't score as well in these measures of productivity, and we lag behind some of our key competitors. So essentially, they can produce more, they can have better quality outputs, they can have higher living standards for putting in less effort. And there's various explanations around why that might be the case. Some of it's the types of products we produce in our economy. Some of it is levels of investment and things like innovation, so coming up with new ideas to become more efficient. Some of it's also about the way we work, so management practices and leadership in our organisations. We tend to lag behind the best countries in the world for having good management and good leadership. We've probably all been in organisations where the person managing us has not incentivised us to do our best in the job. And again, that's one of the areas where the UK has lagged behind. But innovation is crucial to productivity, because it's about the whole idea about coming up with new ideas, new ways of doing things differently. And if we can do things more efficiently, then we can become more productive.
So many questions coming at that. We're never going to get through all this, but there's stuff about free market, how green transition will affect the future. Susan, what are you picking out of these comments that are coming through, that are jumping in?
There's a post there from Jenny Hogan, who's in the Scottish Government, who's working on the Wellbeing Economy Monitor. So that might be worth people looking up if they're interested in that area. There's a comment from Olga Murray, who it says, the free market's been allowed to get away with destroying our planet, which is an interesting comment. How do you think the green transition will affect the future of the free market? I would just pose there, partly from the work that Graeme's been doing in Glasgow on the tercentenary of Adam Smith, but it really got me thinking about how the East India Company manipulated the market. And actually, is there any such thing as a free market? I've been questioning. Lots of the things that people say are free markets are actually more manipulated by people with resources in those to encourage consumption of a certain thing, or and it just got me really thinking around those, that the work you did last year, Graeme. And then there's another one about what do you say to someone who tells you that the economy is just all about money?
That'll be me then, but it's not me, it's somebody else.
And that's one of the bits that really frustrates me about how economics is viewed, or how economists are thought about, that it is about this. People, when they think of economics, they think of the City of London and wandering around in suits, and it's all about finance and all about money. And as I said, for me, it's not. It's about how society makes the really difficult choices about about how it allocates the scarce resources it's got to improve outcomes. And that gets into absolutely everything. The question there about, green economy and just transition and the impact on the planet. I mean, that's a choice. So we're choosing to overuse scarce resources on fossil fuels, on the environment, on nature, on the climate. That's a choice that we are making, to overuse these in exchange for short-term consumption and short-term improvements in consumerism and living standards. That's a choice that society has made over successive generations. The key question is, well, we know that's going to have huge negative implications for society further down the line, or even now it's having devastating implications. So the economics is about how do you resolve that. Like that is the economy is generating that outcome because that's the choices that we're making, and we need to take different choices. And the economy is then the solution to that. It's about saying, look, we're not going to use our scarce resources in the same way as we have done in the past. We're going to look for new ways to try and use resources, or to cut back on resources and trade off the fact that we can't continue to consume and live in exactly the same way as we do at the moment, because we need to continue to protect the planet and restore balance. So all of those decisions, all of those debates, all of those debates about the transition to net zero, all the debates about inequalities are all about the economy. And that's the bit that I think is such a shame. In many ways that economists are viewed as purely being about finance, but the questions we just chatted about there are get to the heart of the economy.
That's so important to me, because I think, right, is it a perception problem then? Because I'm sorry, I'm thinking it's money, it's the financial institutions. It's much more nuanced and rich when you start talking about how it affects your lived life every day. So where's the problem lying here, Graeme? Is it with the public, who maybe should take more responsibility? I'm talking like dumbheads like me that kind of look at the political stuff because that's easier to deal with, and this seems like something alien and a lot of trouble to dig into. Or is it the problem lying with people in your realm who aren't getting across just how relevant and intertwined this is with every single thing we do with our lives every day?
So I think a lot of the blame has to rest on the economics community, and we had Sir Angus Deaton over, the Nobel Prize winner, over last year, and he's scathing about economists and the economics community and how we essentially present ourselves, how we talk to one another, the voices that we value in economics, and that inability to bring in a diversity of thought. And I think so a large part of it, rests on the kind of economics community and how we behave and operate. And I think that's something where a conversation like this, hopefully people can start to think about, well, actually, if you think about everything that you do in your day-to-day life, there's economics at the heart of it. You're making economic decisions. Even to join this call, relative to do something else, you've made a decision to use your scarce resource of time to spend it with us, rather than doing something else. That's an economic decision. And once you start to think like that, everything you do, you can see that everything that matters to society and matters to your well-being has an economics heart of it at the core. And it's not all about money.
But how do you break through that barrier and get to people that wouldn't tune into something like this and say, it's fascinating, look what affects this and that, and these judgment calls that have to be made? How do you break through that barrier?
You're probably asking the wrong person from that. I think this is where you get, I think there's some really interesting books being written around economics. So, Thinking Like an Economist, Thinking Fast, and all that kind of stuff, that the books that are coming out about how you incentivize mindsets as economists. That's crucial. We're working really hard to try and get the next generation of people to come through to see economics as being slightly different, as it is about thinking about inequality, about improving well-being, about the transition to net zero, about protecting nature, about supporting the environment, and trying to change essentially the perception of economics and as economists, and the types of questions that we're really interested in.
Susan, do you want to jump in with your view on why the economy isn't a bit sexier for a wider audience, and especially maybe the younger one? That's something we're going to address, I think, in future sessions.
I think I've frozen. Can you still hear me?
Frozen, but I can still hear you.
Okay, doke. I could do anything with my hands and no one would know. So I just ran out the room there to make a choice with Graeme was telling me to make a choice with my time, just to check that my kids hadn't turned on anything to stream that was consuming my internet, because I noticed I'd frozen. So I'm a bit behind. But what I was thinking just to say is lots of questions about the green transition and resources and the things that Graeme's mentioned, but we can cover those next week because we've got Dieter Helm next week talking about the sustainable economy.
Absolutely, that will be covered off by that, because otherwise we take maybe going to go for another 5 minutes. What do you reckon, Susan? Should we push it a little bit more?
I think we can push it a little bit more. And I'm back now. I've got my camera back, so that's fantastic.
You're unfrozen. It's lovely. Listen, a very interesting discussion about how we address the communication gap and lure people into thinking more about the economy. But of course, this is I could ask you all sorts about demographics, about the word growth, about the lexicon. We can talk about that. But I'm thinking we're in an election year, probably. We're thinking the end of the year. What, Graeme, are you and your colleagues looking out for as we head into that political debate, manifesto, promises scenario? What is it that you're...
Can I add to that, Claire? Graeme's mentioned outcomes a few times, and it kind of connects to some of the questions. And I just wondered, it connects to something he said in the introduction as well. Quite often the election promises about different parties taking different decisions with resources, but it's also about whose outcomes. So different parties prioritize different bits of the electorate for outcomes. And I'm really interested in how the media, so back onto you, Claire, how you choose which audience you target the questions for. Because I was watching Kinnersberg on Sunday and I was interested that there was definitely the top 10% seemed to get much more time in that discussion about the questions that were being asked than the rest of the population yesterday. And I was that just all connects. So first to Graeme, but then turning it back on you, Claire.
So I think the broader question about where we are thinking the election and what happens next. So I mean, there's a couple of things I would say. So when I was a student of economics coming through, we were in what was called the nice decade. So essentially, growth was stable, unemployment was low, inflation was low, and we'd cracked. I mean, if you remember, Gordon Brown had talked a lot about abolishing boom and bust, and everything was great and rosy. If you think about the last 15 years, we've had financial crisis, we've then had Brexit, we've then had a pandemic, we've had a cost of living crisis. So our economy's been buffeted by a series of quite short-term damaging shocks, have really shaken our economy to its core, widened inequalities, made the government's fiscal position really quite difficult, and made the cost of living and living standards for people slip back a number of years. So I think the election is going to be dominated by essentially who is going to come forward with ideas and solutions to try and solve that. And that will dominate the debate. The one plea that I have is in the Fiscal Commission is that yes, the short term is important. I get that. The next 5 years are really important. But see, if you look beyond the next 5 years, the transformation that's going to happen to our economy is going to be absolutely huge. We've spoken some great questions there about the transition to net zero and climate change. If you think about our economy, for the best part of 150 years, our economy has been fueled by carbon, and we're talking about removing it in the next 10 to 15 years. That is unbelievable in terms of the economic transformation. It's going to fundamentally change everything that we do, and that's happening. It's going to have to happen, and it's going to have to happen very quickly. Demographics, you mentioned, Claire, our population, the average age of our population is aging. That's a great thing. The fact that we're living longer is brilliant, but it comes with consequences for our economy in terms of delivering public services, but also in terms of how you deal with an economy where people are going to be older in your economy and maybe working longer, and that's going to radically change the way that things work. So I guess my kind of comment and plea to people involved in these debates is, yes, I get the need to discuss some of the short-term challenges, but the big questions are coming, and the sooner we take decisions now to address these big challenges and get ahead of them, then the better we'll be. And that would be my one hope in the election. Maybe it's a bit of a forlorn hope, but is that we do have a really big policy debate about these long-term changes that are going to dominate our economic future.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. On the media point, though, not to dodge that, I think the problem is we just get used to talking to the same people all the time, and we don't actually analyse what they're telling us, or how we're shutting out quite a lot of people from the noise. I think we could be better at that in the media, but I also think that out of adversity comes opportunity. So you've just listed a whole bunch of things that are going wrong with the economy, the insecurity everyone's feeling. That's a brilliant opportunity to reach out to the public that don't even know what the economy really is, and explain it to them better. And somebody, where did I see it? Somebody says, Susan Lampert says, I started my introductory economics course last week. Some examples of the variety of things that economics covers and the economics research. Students love this kind of context. Came as a surprise to them to find out what economics is actually about. Oh God, amen. Another one here, LinkedIn user, how would an economist define those with the broadest shoulders in the economy? Can Graeme say something about the communication cliches that muddy our understanding of choices? So right back at you, Graeme.
Yeah, so we love phrases. So those with the broadest shoulders, you'll hear things like governments having fiscal headroom and all those different types of phrases that are used by the media to try and resonate or at least relate some of these questions there. I mean, I guess, again, so the economist, what does it mean by the broadest shoulders? Again, this is the thing, it's all subjective. So people's views about who has the broadest shoulders differ, and it comes back to the very first point about, where the scarce resources are in all of that. And ultimately, it's a political decision and a subjective decision by individuals about who's that there. But what we see in a society and an economy like Scotland, and like most high-income economies around the world, is huge levels of inequality in terms of the allocation of these scarce resources that I was talking about. So your income, the amount of free time that you have, again, varies hugely across whether you're in a fortunate position or an unfortunate position. The opportunities to educate, to take advantage of wealth, all of those things vary greatly across an economy, which is meant to have stabilization mechanisms and things to try and ensure resources are shared, and it doesn't work like that. And that point about those with the broadest shoulders essentially is so much of that wealth and so much of the income is concentrated in a small number of people. And the question is, what can you get the people who've got that advantage to do more for the collective good? And the question then therefore is who do you define in that people who are fortunate versus less fortunate?
Absolutely. We're probably running out of time now, and we're going to ask this of all of our guests, Graeme. So it's not just you. You've been brilliant. You've been a sterling performer. What's the one thing that you wish everyone knew about the economy, and why? Another small question.
Yeah, and we've actually covered it, and it's been great that it's come up naturally. I think for me, the thing that I hope that people understand about the economy is that the economy is not about finance. The economy is about how society makes really difficult choices about the scarce resources that it has at its disposal. And that's what economics is about. And I think if people can understand that, then hopefully they become engaged in thinking about the economy. The economy matters to everybody. It matters because the decisions that we take impact on others, and it matters because the decisions that other people take are going to impact on us. So when you hear debates about the economy and policymakers in an election talking about their plans for the economy, I hope people really engage with it, because they're not talking to somebody else, they're talking to all of us, and we should all have a really, really strong view about whether we agree or disagree about the decisions that they're taking.
I can't resist asking you this, because when we asked you to do this, Susan solicited a question from you, and it was a really interesting one. Susan, have you got it to hand there? If not, I have, that Graeme wanted to put, which is really, it's tantalizing. We might have to get into it in another way, but I just want to mention it.
It was about how our economy ends up generating unfair outcomes is it guaranteed or is it a deliberate choice? And I was just like, wow, Graeme, of all the things that I thought you might ask, I wasn't thinking about that one. So yeah, it really got me thinking. I don't think we've got time, Claire, to get into it now.
I know. Are you off the hook then? I think, do you want to say something very briefly about it?
I'm more than happy to be off the hook on that one. So.
Okay, thank you so much.
I think all it means, Claire, is we put Graeme back on the hook for another session in future.
Yes.
Once we're a bit further down the line and the audience has gone with us a bit more on a journey, we come back and we do some of the other questions we could get to today, because I think
plenty.
Graeme's knowledge of Scotland is so good on the economy, and I think what we're going to do is go to some different places and different speakers for the next few sessions to get a different view from different places. So next week is David Hume from the University of Oxford, talking about sustainable economy, and he's written endless numbers of books on it, I think. Last time I saw him in Scotland, he was talking about the soil and how we undervalue soil as an economic thing. That was fascinating. And the week after that, we've got Dr. Aaron Advani talking about tax, but he also has done lots of research on the diversity of economists. So I want to see if we can squeeze in conversations on both while he's here, if we can.
Plenty coming up then. Thank you, Mike Stevenson. You've got some interesting points as well. That investment in education is key to economic success. Olga, you're welcome. It's very lovely to have your conversations. This is what it's all about. There's another thank you. Thank you, Graeme, says Mike. There we go. We're going to wind it up there. Wonderful having you with us, Graeme. You tidied up your living room as well. What do you want to say? Very grateful. I did not. Susan's told you what's coming up. More generally, if you enjoyed today's presentation, please check in with us. But from Susan, Graeme and myself, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.